The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw Lem, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. Professor Lao Tzu. We carried the professor and Osvetich into the lock chamber. After hoisting the motorboat on board, I descended into the corridor. There, Raina and Tarland were laying the two helpless bodies in their diving suits on stretchers, just as we had lifted them from the boat. Only their helmets had been removed. Their faces were covered in sweat and pale as wax. I wanted to help, but Arseniev ordered me to go to the control center. He ordered immediate launch. In the excitement of the last few minutes, I hadn't even thought about what was happening above the lake. Yellowish tangles swirled on the television screens, like the smoke from burning sulfur. The rocket rose and fell on the waves. The entire area had become a dark cauldron of rumbling, humming, whooshing, hissing, and whistling. As I entered the control center, the first crack of thunder crashed in the clouds. I switched on the atomic column, and without waiting for it to reach full power, I set the predictor levers to take off with auxiliary fuel. Fiery gases swirled around the lake. The boiling water gurgled and bubbled dully. The cosmic crater trembled and immediately afterward tilted slightly to one side. It spread across the surface, pushing a huge mountain of water before it. The waves lashed furiously at it, but it glided ever faster over them, and then it rose into the realm of the raging storm. On the screens, the rocks along the shore bent and contorted, as if in convulsions. Just don't collide with them, I thought, constantly increasing the combustion in the reactor turbines. Only when the nuclear engines began their mighty song did I breathe a sigh of relief. Their roar drowned out the thunder of the waves and the howling of the storm. White-blue streaks of haze raced across the screens. At one point the rocket hit a cloud so thick that it became as dark as the deepest forest. I was excited and uneasy. For the first time during the difficult moment of takeoff, I was standing alone, completely on my own, at the pilot house. But everything went well. The wind whistled in the control panels, yet the engines worked smoothly, without interference, and the speed increased. Every moment violet streams of fire leaped from cloud to cloud, scattering with prolonged thunderclaps. Saltic entered the control center. Without taking my eyes off the instruments, I bombarded him with questions. It took a while before he began to speak. As it turned out, he had inflated the suit with air before entering the water. This insulating layer protected him from burns. The professor's situation was worse. He couldn't use this protective device because his diving glove was torn at the base of his helmet. He had been holding the damaged area with one hand the entire way, but when they carried Osvetich across the water, he had to have both hands free. In that short period of time, the formaldehyde gases and carbon dioxide had already mixed with the air he was breathing. In the motorboat, Lao Tzu lost consciousness. And how is Osvetich? Where did you find him? I asked. Saltik hesitated to answer. He stood in front of the panel with the brake indicators and looked at them with apparent attention, even though the brakes weren't in operation. Osvetich has suffered heat stroke, he said finally, but I don't think he's in too bad a condition. When we carried him, he started moving again. Well, thank God. Where was he then? I don't know. You don't know. On the screens, dark clouds drifted by between bright, billowing bands of fog. They gave the impression that we were flying over a mountainous archipelago. The professor gave me the rope. We tied it around our bodies. Then he ordered me to walk behind him so that it would always remain taut, and went ahead. And then he found Osvetich. Where? I don't know. Suddenly he disappeared. The professor? Yes, he disappeared as if the earth had swallowed him. and as he did so, I felt his movements because we were connected by the rope. Do you understand that? No, you can't understand that. I tell you, just as you see me here, in front of you, I saw the rope in front of me. It ended in the air, taut, and behind it was nothing. Nothing. That is, there were stones, air, but neither the professor nor Ostfitich was to be seen. And after maybe a minute, the rope jerked. That was the agreed-upon signal. I started pulling and pulled them both out. The professor had a reef in his diving suit. Did he fall? I don't know. Sure. Where had he been? I already told you, I don't know. Why didn't you ask him? No. You hadn't either after. He suddenly turned his dark red, distorted face to me. When you were gone, I behaved like a young dog, I whined, then shouted at him, for he gradually walked around with his apparatus as if in a laboratory. I don't know, I couldn't know why. After a while, he added more calmly, back on Earth, someone had told me that Lao Tzu was like a tempered glass, transparent, smooth, and conspicuous, but whoever tried to bite it would break his teeth on it. He continued. I wanted to justify myself. He answered me with some kind of proverb. The stones burned beneath our feet. I thought we were going to melt. And he... Do you know what his first words were when he came into the cabin? He asked Chandrasekhar, do we already have the results of the calculations? The cosmic crater had reached its cruising speed. I stepped back from the screens, but avoided looking at Soltic. It was probably better for him. Lao Tzu had taught him a lesson in calm, and under what circumstances. I thought of my adventure in the dead forest. If you won't go to him, said Soltic, I'll represent you. I can't look him in the eyes. I didn't need to be told twice. As I entered the cabin, Tarland was just removing the cellophane tent from Osvitich's belt, under which an artificial oxygen atmosphere had been created. The sick man, lying on piled up pillows, had already turned red again. His breathing was regular. The scientists sat round the table, and among them, to my great surprise, was the Chinese man. He wasn't wearing a dark suit as usual. For the first time, I saw him in a long cherry-red silk dressing gown, painted with magnificent dragons. He was wrapped up to his hips in a blanket, from beneath which the bandaged joint peeped out. Lao Tzu was calm as always, only a little paler than usual. Arsenyev moved aside. I sat down. Osvitich had just begun to recount his experience. In a few words, he described our walk around the white sphere, and now came to the moment when, deceived by the shape of the dark stone, I had moved away from him. As he told me, he had moved on. He hadn't heard my calls. Suddenly, everything around him had disappeared. One after another, all the colours of the rainbow, from the brightest yellow to the deepest violet, began to glow. At the same time, something pulled me to the ground. I lost my balance, staggered a few steps further. Suddenly, a glare so bright flashed before me that I was blinded for several minutes. When I opened my eyes, I found myself inside a huge sphere, filled with white light, completely smooth, curved walls surrounding me on all sides. At first I thought there must be an opening behind me through which I had entered. I turned around but saw nothing. The same smooth wall everywhere. The ground I stood on was rocky, strewn with stones. Am I making myself clear enough? It was as if someone had cut off the bottom of a hollow sphere and trapped me inside like a fly, placing it over me. Slowly, step by step, I approached the centre of the circle, examining each stone. Now something quite strange happened. I had walked perhaps 4 or 5 meters further, when the curved wall receded in front of me. I took 2 more steps forward, and stood in front of a vertical, completely flat wall. I turned around. Behind me was impenetrable darkness. I approached the flat wall, and the closer I got, the more it bulged, as if someone were inflating it from behind me. I was already so close to it, I thought I could touch it with my hand. Suddenly, I was standing under the wall of a gigantic sphere. This time I was outside the sphere. I ran around it. It was as large as the white sphere, smooth all over, without a trace of cracks or holes. The fact that I had left the hollow space behind me and was outside calmed me. I assumed I also would also find my way out of the darkness that surrounded me, but I had barely moved a few steps away when the sphere began to change its shape. It stretched out in height and width, expanded, and suddenly covered me again. Once again I found myself inside. Now I ran sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left. Whenever I reached the middle, the walls flattened out in front of me, rolled up on the opposite side, and I stood again in deep darkness before the sphere. And when I went into this darkness, the sphere extended behind me, flattened, contracted, and encircled me again from all sides. At first I thought it was some kind of mechanism, but such a mechanism could not have worked in this way. Then I tried to get out with a few quick jumps, tumbling madly in this direction or that, but always I encountered a smooth wall. It was too horrible to describe. Completely black, impenetrable darkness. In the center of the sphere that once swallowed me up and then threw me out again. And there was no sign of an opening. Wherever I turned, I always encountered the smooth wall. These large white surfaces rotated before my eyes, twisted, swallowed me, spat me out over and over again. I don't know how long it lasted. Perhaps an hour. After a while, it became unbearably hot. The ground glowed beneath my feet. It felt as if my helmet had already heated up to red heat. Breathing became increasingly difficult. The air in my diving suit burned like fire. The cooling device was no longer of any use. I was suffocating, and then I fell and hit my head against a rock. How it went on, I don't know. Osvetich, who had straightened up a little, sank back exhaustedly into the pillow. Then he continued quietly. That's all. I don't understand any of it. There isn't even a trace of meaning in it. I disagree, Ostenyev interjected. Do you perhaps think I've seen ghosts? Not at all. But as for the meaninglessness of an environment, well, an ant that fell into a typewriter could say the same thing. The world doesn't revolve around us, and here we have accidentally entered the sphere of influence of unknown forces. Although we don't yet know everything, said Lao Tzu, we can still explain our companion's adventure. I am able to answer the question how this or that happened, but it worries me that I don't yet know the purpose for which it all happens. Can you explain to me how I got inside the sealed sphere? Yes, I can. And why I found myself outside it and then inside it again. That too. And where did the light come from there, even though there was complete darkness all round? Yes. Then talk at last. Just two words are the key to the secret, said the physicist. You were in spherical space. He moved closer to the table. How do we see an object? By the light rays reflected from it reaching our eyes. But if all the rays are enclosed in a limited space and must remain there, this space becomes invisible to the observer standing outside, and not as if there were a dark spot at this point, corresponding to the dimensions of the space. The light rays either bypass this spot or enter it. In both cases, however, the spherical space, that is precisely this light trap, remains invisible. The observer has the impression that this space has been cut out of the image of the surrounding landscape, and that the edge of this section have connected in an imperceptible way. When you stood on the raised area by the first oscilloscope, you didn't know what to do because you suddenly couldn't see the white sphere anymore. It had disappeared. That's how it was, wasn't it? Osvetich and I nodded. Well, it was still there, but invisible to you. And here's the explanation. When the sphere is active, it creates a gravitational field that bends space. If the curvature exceeds a certain limit, then space, so to speak, rolls up and closes in on itself. The spherical space created in this way can expand or contract like a bubble, depending on the field strength. When Osvetich reached the 10th device, there was a sudden increase in the gravitational potential. The spherical space expanded and seemingly swallowed the space on which Osvetich was standing. A short time later, gravity decreased again. The spherical space contracted. During this time, however, Osvetich had already moved closer to the white sphere, and therefore Smith could only see empty space. This is the solution to the first riddle. Now let's move on. You noticed a rainbow. The physicist addressed Osvitich. That is very revealing. At that moment, the boundary between spherical and normal space was exactly where you were standing. Due to interference and specific refraction conditions, the white daylight refracts at the point of contact between the two types of spaces, like in a prism. Where did the light that blinded you come from? As long as the white sphere is active with sufficient intensity, the spherical space around it, both day and night, is illuminated by the light rays that were captured in the spherical space during the day. You can no longer escape and are now trapped orbiting in this space. Let's go further. The sphere you thought you were inside was, of course, the white sphere, but you were outside it the whole time, and the illusion that you had entered the interior was caused by the perspective of spherical space, which is different from the linear perspective of the world around us. You behaved, please forgive me for this comparison, like a drunk who constantly runs around kiosk, lamenting that he has been locked out inside. Your imprisonment inside the sphere was only apparent. That's impossible. Do you think so? Lao Tzu reached for the sheet of paper and drew as he continued. In ordinary space, we see a sphere in this way because light travels in the shortest, that is to say, straightest path. In spherical space, however, light describes circular paths. Therefore, when you stood in front of the white sphere, you saw it in this way. The eye located at point A perceives not only the front part of the sphere, which lies opposite, but also the rear part, which is invisible to us under normal condition. But when even under normal conditions do we see the entire surface of the sphere at once, only when we are inside it, and so you believed you were inside the sphere. A person sees this sphere in the manner described when they have just entered spherical space. If they go further into its depth, they notice that the sphere changes its shape, first flattening and then bulging. These illusions are also caused by the peculiarities of spherical perspectives. When an object moves away from us in ordinary space, it appears smaller and smaller. None of us thinks at this moment that the reduction is due to the laws of perspective, but in the space surrounding the white sphere, in the space in which light moves its circular paths, spherical perspective prevails. An object, in our case the sphere, appears, viewed from close up, like a curved body from a greater distance than an infinite plane, and from an even greater distance than a concave surface. I could also easily prove this to you by constructing the images of spherical perspectives by stereographic projection of the cones of the light tangents. For this purpose it is sufficient to know the diameters of the circular paths described by the light, but I would prefer to limit myself here to comparisons. With railroad tracks, we have the impression that they converge at the horizon, even though we know full well that they are still parallel, and their convergence is merely a perspective illusion. Likewise, the impression that the sphere alternately flattened and curved was also an illusion. If we lived in spherical space from birth, we would no longer consider the images we saw to be real changes in shape, but would learn to use them to estimate distance, just as in ordinary space we learn from a distance that objects appear to shrink as they move away from the observer. But why couldn't I get out of there, if, as you say, I was constantly outside the sphere? Asked Osvitich. The physicist smiled almost imperceptibly. If you had continued walking in one direction outside the sphere, with your eyes closed, you would have had the opportunity to cross the boundary of spherical space, but you were guided by what your gaze told you, and this obeyed the rules of the dispersion of light in circles. You walked like that. And why didn't I get into this room? I asked, even though I carefully searched the entire area. Because you fell victim to a similar deception as Osvitich. I'll mark the point where Osvitich disappeared with an O. And now please note, please show me in which direction you were looking for your companion. In this direction and this direction, I replied, and drew the corresponding arrows to the point the physicist had marked on the sketch. That's how it seemed to you, said the professor, but that was an illusion. In reality, that's how you walked. Why? Because you too followed the instructions of the eye, and the eye is the servant of light. The rays of light bend at the edge of spherical space and run like the arrows I drew. I raised my gaze from the paper and looked at the physicist. Did you already know all this when you met us, Professor? No, I only knew that gravity was increasing. Do you remember that we walked leaning to one side, as if we were about to fall over at any moment? Oh yes, I even asked you. That's because in addition to the effect of normal gravity directed vertically to one downwards, there was the attraction exerted by the white sphere that gave me this idea. But that was enough for you. After all, I'm a physicist, he said. And how did you find Auschwitz again? To enter the spherical space, once I had to rely on a guide other than the eye. What kind of guide? I don't understand. It's something very big. All our work so far has been devoted to it. Can't you really guess? Well, the tube. I found its echo with the help of the induction apparatus and followed the trail that led straight to the white sphere. Spherical space only bends light rays, not objects. How simple it all is, isn't it? The engineer and I tied ourselves together with the rope. He stayed on it. I went into the room and found Auschwitz. It was a strange sight, said Lao Tzu after a while. The rope stretched from me in a straight line and suddenly broke in the middle of space. Why in the middle of space? Where else, in your opinion? At the border. The special thing about the boundary of spherical space is that you can't see it. So let's also sketch what both Soltic and I observed when the rope crossed the boundary of spherical space at a certain point. That's really how it was. And so we saw it. He from the outside, and I from the inside. Amazing, I said. No more amazing, he replied, than the phenomenon that a spoon placed in a glass of water appears to break. It's all a matter of habit. Why did you connect yourself to Soltic with the rope? I wanted to know. Didn't the tube lead you out of spherical space as well as into it? Possible, said the physicist evenly, but I was afraid I would lose consciousness there. The temperature was constantly rising. And how did you tear your diving suit? And, Professor, I blurted out, I saw you and Soltic go into the water. Well, I was lost for words. It was hot, said Lao Tzu. Well, we were discussing certain phenomena that we observed. Allow me to use the example given by Professor Arseniev. He compared us to an ant that has accidentally found itself inside a typewriter. What we just discussed was only a general explanation of how the machine works, but we have not yet discussed the far more essential matters, namely, who is writing on this machine and what text they are writing. I would be pleased if Professor Chandrasekhar would comment on this topic. After all, he has crowned the work that you began, the mathematician remarked, that we accomplished together. Arseniev interjected. For each of us has fulfilled his duty. Chandrasekhar leafed through the papers and films before him and pulled out the photograph of that double curve I had seen on the Marek screen a few hours earlier. He examined it thoughtfully for a while and then said, at the base of the white sphere, I suspect a vacuum accelerator in which the atoms are accelerated almost to the speed of light. Consistent with Einstein's transmutation, enormous atomic masses are formed, and these are precisely the sources of the energy, which reaches billions of kilowatts. It flows to the white sphere through the 11 tubes, each of which has its own frequency. I would like to emphasize that without Marx we would have been at a loss analyzing oscillations. We now know that one cycle of activity of the white sphere lasts 296 hours and is composed of two fundamental phases. In the first, positive phase, the generated gravity is added to the planet's attraction. In the second, the negative phase, the attraction is cancelled. As you know, each phase consists of a series of low power peaks. We entered the sphere of influence of the white sphere at a time when the field tension was positive. It was already weakening considerably, and the difficulties we encountered were caused by this small jump here in the curve. We leaned over the table and observed the slight rise and fall of the curve, to which the mathematician pointed as he continued. It would have been worse during the negative phase. Anyone who had approached the sphere, freed from the planet's attraction, would have risen like a balloon and would now be orbiting in interplanetary space. Well, that's not what we're talking about at the moment. It's more about, in the words of our colleague, Lao, how this machine works. But much more important to us is the answer to the question of what this complicated gravitational cycle, which lasts 296 hours, and after which all the jumps and delays repeat themselves unchanged from the beginning, what can be the purpose, the meaning of such enormous energy discharges? The mathematician paused for a moment, and as he continued, he rapped his knuckles on the table with each word. These phenomena caused by the white sphere can neither frighten nor astonish us researchers and scientists. Rather, something quite different amazes and frightens us, namely, that these phenomena have no meaning and serve no purpose at all. I felt an ashy shiver run down my spine. How do you understand that, Professor? I asked, my voice trembling. Just as I said. I can't add a single word. Just a moment, excuse me, but this is completely puzzling to me. In your opinion, the creation of such a gravitational pole has no meaning. Maybe we wouldn't build something like that on Earth, but that's a misunderstanding, said the physicist. We know one purpose for which such a gravitational pole could be created. I'm thinking of firing interplanetary missiles. So, the white sphere would be... Please let me finish. We use rockets on Earth, powered by nuclear energy. After the catastrophe that befell the spacecraft sent to Earth, it's possible that the Venusians preferred to use a different method. In the future, they decided to fight gravity with gravity. And how? A precise explanation would go too far. Suffice it to say that this involves something that, figuratively speaking, could be described as drilling a hole in the planet's gravitational field. You know, of course, that an electric charge can be neutralized by a charge of the opposite side. Of course, it's similar here. The Venusians locally eliminate the planet's gravitational pull with the help of an artificially created gravity that works in the opposite direction. Under these circumstances, a minimal propulsion force is sufficient to launch a spaceflight. So that's how it is, said Osvitich. And I added, so the white sphere has a purpose, and a very clear one at that. So why did Professor Chandrasekhar say that? Perhaps it once had a purpose, said the mathematician, emphasizing each word. But now it no longer has one. Why on earth? Why, I can certainly understand the purpose of an automaton that sets switches and signals for oncoming trains, said Chandrasekhar, looking at me appraising with dark eyes. But I can't understand the purpose of an automaton that clears the way for anyone and for nothing. How? How should I understand that? Quite simple. At certain intervals, the sphere creates a gravitational field that counteracts the planet's attraction. It serves no purpose and it serves no one. The interplanetary missiles are non-existent, and there's not the slightest indication that anyone intends to launch them. This entire device is nothing but a massive catapult that, after a certain time, with an enormous expenditure of energy, opens up space and injects nothing into it. That's really hard to understand, said Osvitich, with a furrowed brow. His lips pursed in a sharp line. He gazed absently into the distance. You're right, it's very hard to understand, replied Chandrasekhar, with a slight sigh. I've already considered various possibilities. Perhaps you would like to say something about this. I could imagine that one or more spaceships have already been launched, and the white sphere is now active because its return is expected, said Ostradich. Perhaps it would be easier to keep it constantly active, than to only start it up when the ship is taken off or about to land. Chandrasekhar nodded. We've considered such a possibility. However, this assumption collapses into nothing in the fire of a physical mathematical analysis. The white sphere can be activated within a few seconds. The energy waste with which it currently operates is astonishing. and given that such excellent design is as the inhabitants of Venus. According to a cursory calculation, the output of this facility is around 100 billion kilowatts. Perhaps these are experiments, I suggested. Experiments? Cried Arsenyev. He jumped up and sat on the table with his fist. Stop. These are supposed to be experiments. Experiments that have been going on for months. Because so much time has already passed since we arrived here, and the sphere is always acting in the same way. These are supposed to be experiments? I don't believe it. In addition to the purely intellectual prerequisites, I also have my instincts as a physicist and mathematician. When I look at these graphic representations, everything comes flooding back to me. This waxing and waning, this sluggish flow of currents, these sudden jumps and the equally sudden drops in tension. What does it all mean? He slammed his fist on the table. I've been sitting over this stuff for 3 hours. It's all so absurd, nonsensical, idiotic. Quite simply idiotic, you see? By the way, what does this burst torn pipe in the ravine mean? And the crater? Those are supposed to be traces of the experiments, aren't they? He made a helplessly angry face and slumped into the chair. There's one more thing. Perhaps it should be considered, said Osvetich. He spoke very quietly, as if he wasn't yet sure of himself. I'm thinking of the protoplasm in the Black River. Wouldn't it be possible that it created all this and then degenerated, that is, when it underwent animalization? Oh, you think the planet is the only the planet? You think the planet is the only inhabitant of Venus? I explained. I exclaimed. The image absolutely stunned me with its unusualness. Deep within the planet's interior, a murky slimy jelly underpinning continents, penetrating the surface, piercing mountains. The entire planet is its bed. A rigid network of channels and tubes filled with breathing, blind matter creates bases for spaceships, living rivers. Lao Tzu leaned over the table. That wouldn't solve the problem, in my opinion. Plasma is not someone in itself, but rather serves someone. In other words, it is a kind of tool, like yeast or penicillin fungi are for us. I almost felt sorry for the uncanny, fantastic image that Osvetich's assumption had conjured up in me. Isn't there a possibility that it possesses a high level of intelligence? I began. But the Chinese man shook his head. No, plasma cannot possess intelligence because it is limited to a narrow, specialized field. It can only do one thing: generate electricity. Perhaps this is precisely evidence of a highly advanced development, I pointed out. And intelligence. This has nothing to do with intelligence, the Chinese man explained. Do you perhaps consider the sun intelligent because it is so economical with nuclear energy? Intelligence is not characterized by narrow specialization. It is the exact opposite. Universal versatility. Yes, but where are the real inhabitants of this planet? I cried. Why haven't we met them yet? Where are they hiding? I'm afraid nowhere, said the Chinese man. He stood up, wrapped himself in the colourful silk of his dressing gown, and limped slowly to the door. When he left the cabin, an incomprehensible horror remained.